Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Олексій Мельник of Разумкov Center. Sir, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to such distinguished audience. And I'm going to use this opportunity, first of all, to thank on behalf of myself, because I do not represent Ukraine. I can thank very sincerely for all the support being provided for Ukraine during these hard times. Also, I'm very pleased to share some of my expertise and knowledge, and perhaps to give you some good suggestions how to protect yourself, how to better defend yourself from this very, very serious threat of Russian hybrid war. Usually we say about, or we mention like hybrid war is going for 5 years already. In fact, we can establish the date of the beginning of the occupation of Crimea, which was written on the medal provided by the Kremlin, is 20th of February. But we also can establish the beginning of military operation in Donbass. But in fact, the hybrid war which we are talking about has started much earlier. And I don't know what was the exact date, but at least I can point out or a couple of references. For instance, in 2003, there was a Tuzla incident. Ambassador Hurst remembers very well because he was involved to some extent in dealing with this crisis. But why this case was interesting? Because I think it was the first time when Russia or the Kremlin or Putin, whatever you like, used non-military, paramilitary forces to conduct purely military operation of annexation of insignificant or very small part of Ukrainian land, which was Tuzla Island in the Kerch Strait. So I would call it the first Kerch Strait incident. Then I can also mention not a conflict, but kind of this operation done by the Kremlin in 2006, I believe, when the international exercises, Sea Breeze, were blocked in Crimea. And it was done carefully planned, well organized, and done by elderly ladies, organized by someone who blocked American forces, who blocked Ukrainian law enforcement, just, you know, to not make it happen. And that's what Putin repeated in 2014. You remember his speech, then he said that we would put locals and civilians in front and our soldiers will stay behind them. And also we remember this number of so-called energy wars when in the middle of winter Russia would cut gas supplies to leave without natural gas not only Ukraine but almost the whole Europe, and it was repeated a couple of times. So my point is that in a hybrid war it's hard to establish the beginning of this war, and it's hard to establish or to see clear what kind of weapons are going to be used this time. Because talking about weaponization, we can see energy, economy, money, laundering or money itself, religion, language, prisoners of war, political hostages, even justice, international rules, everything can be weaponized. And General Gerasimov, which Ambassador mentioned, already has described this, I mean, blaming Americans, but he described real Russian tactics, that everything can be used for military purpose. And anytime at their judgment, they will use military. Either when they see that cannot achieve their objectives by non-military means, or they see the opportunity to use the military, whatever limited, not very large scale, but to use the military and run or escape unpunished. It's been rightly mentioned that Ukraine is both a target and a testing ground for Russian hybrid war tactics, but also I would emphasize that Ukraine is a great source of information and expertise, because we are not just suffering, we are fighting back, and when you hear from Ukrainians that we defend Europe, don't take it like we are defending Europe from Russian tanks. It's not just about military. It's about gaining this experience. It's about analyzing this experience, sharing this experience, and developing preventive measures. Ukraine now at a very crucial point. In a couple of weeks we have presidential elections. It will be a serious test for Ukraine's democracy. It will be also a serious test for Ukrainian society and for Ukrainian political elite. And as again was mentioned, we care more about, of course we care about the outcomes, Ukrainians, but we care even more about the quality of the elections. Ukrainians, as we well know, might be divided on plenty of different items or issues that are at stake in these elections. But they are utterly united in their desire to live in free, prosperous, democratic, and European Ukraine. And the Kremlin, I'm afraid, has different ideas and different hopes for Ukraine's prospects. Because if we're trying to understand what are the roots of this conflict, that we should admit probably that as much as Russia for Ukraine now is an existential threat, to the same extent Ukraine is perceived by Russia as the essential threat. It's not about the Ukrainian nationalists. It's not about oppression of a Russian-speaking population. It's about at least two main points, because if Ukraine one day become prosperous, free, really independent country, then it will be the end for the Putin's regime, because Ukraine can present a different model of development for the Russian society. If Ukraine one day becomes a real member of the European Euro-Atlantic society, I'm not talking about formal membership in the EU or NATO. If Ukraine one day becomes, or in the eyes of the Russians, a member of European and Euro-Atlantic society, that will be the end of the Putin's imperial and geopolitical ambition. And that's why Putin will not stop, and he will not be satisfied with any concessions made or compromise made by Ukrainian less than complete surrender. If you ask me about probably advices or suggestions, I don't have a recipe, because we tried not to provoke Putin. We are trying to fight back. And definitely, if you are trying not to provoke Putin, you encourage an aggressor. If you're fighting back, you suffer, but I don't see any other way. Regarding also some very simple, probably suggestions, there are plenty of good people in Russia. There are maybe good politicians, but my big advice would be aware of Russian tourists, be aware of Russian observers, be aware of the Russian money. And yeah, maybe one more point, which is, I think, interesting to mention in this building. Ukrainian parliament was accused of denying the access of the Russian observers to the Ukrainian elections, and I know there's still a discussion this way. I made very short investigation and just look in the Google, and Google in Ukraine also gives you links to the Russian sources, the first list. And for instance, two young ladies who are pretending to come as independent observers in the Ukrainian elections. They are representatives of the Russian NGO, and one of them was from the Российский фонд свободных выборов, Russian Fund of Free Elections. And guess then you look at the leadership, and you have two people who are in charge of this fund. The chairman of the board is a 3-star Russian general, retired, but still the Russian general. And the executive director is the graduate of the Russian FSB Academy. And as we all know, there is no former KGB agents. And these two guys probably will instruct and probably will give some certain task, not just to watch and learn how Ukrainians are good in their elections. And we'll stop there and ready to answer your questions. Thank you.